Rolling Stones. Now, the Stones rose to prominence as sort of the antithesis to the Beatles, and we'll talk more about how that image was cultivated and what it consists of. But if you have the Beatles on one hand, it's quite common to hear people place the Rolling Stones on the other as part of an ongoing debate between which is the greatest classic rock band of all time. That's a pretty common discussion topic. So they're considered an anti-Beatles band, and that was predominantly the invention of their own manager. Much like Brian Epstein for the Beatles, their manager, Andrew Oldham, helped them arrive at this rough and rebellious outlaw image that they continue to pervade to this day. However, it should be mentioned that at first Oldham wanted them to imitate the Beatles and presented them in matching suits and haircuts, much like the Beatles. However, it didn't work as well as just an imitation of the original thing, and while the Beatles were still touring, and the band members tended to undermine his efforts, and so he decided to swing in the exact opposite direction and have them lean into the bad boy look. The story here is that the Rolling Stones hired the Hells Angels, which is a motorcycle club, to function as security at this concert. However, when one of the fans was trying to get on the stage, Meredith Hunter, the Hells Angels that were guarding and functioning as security there actually stabbed him to death. And as Meredith Hunter was a black man, in the context of civil rights activity and other things going on in the late 60s, this was definitely a bad look for the Rolling Stones. But this event sort of encapsulates the feeling of danger and associations with violence that the Rolling Stones had, just sort of surrounding the aura of their career. Even as early as 1964, the Rolling Stones were marketing themselves as the band that your parents love to hate. Maybe they could have their young teenage girl go to a Beatles concert, go to the Ed Sullivan Show, and buy the Beatles records. But the Rolling Stones, no chance. They didn't want their children going anywhere near the Stones. And so this was part of the sort of bad boy image that ultimately helped to generate sales for them. Now, the Rolling Stones were known for really leaning into rhythm and blues influences from rock and roll. So, whereas that was always present within skiffle and the kinds of things that the Beatles were doing, the Rolling Stones really sought to go back to the roots of these musical traditions, which typically were from within black musical communities. We'll talk about that more in just a second. But to continue the overview, the Rolling Stones also incorporated an Indian, that is from India, instrument called the sitar, which was popular in many rock bands at the time, including the Beatles. You can hear this instrument on Painted Black, for example, in the Spotify playlist. Now, the Rolling Stones remains, even to this day, one of the longest touring and enduring rock bands. And so because they've seen and weathered, in a sense, all these changes in rock music history, many people consider the Rolling Stones to be the quintessential rock music band. I want to talk about the Rolling Stones' legacy in regards to race, which is a very relevant topic and will come up time and time again in this course. The Rolling Stones scholar Victor Coelho talks about how the Stones show the truest connection to the roots of rock and roll music in the blues. And we can see this in many of their songs linked to common themes or topics of blues music. For example, their song Gimme Shelter is associated with a sort of sense of post-Woodstock disillusionment and specifically Vietnam protest. As we looked at back in week 2, blues music often functioned sort of a dual function as protest music, and this was also true of some of the Rolling Stones songs. Now, the scholar Jack Hamilton, who is an expert in talking about rock and roll music history and race, talks about the Rolling Stones as that they considered themselves to be, first and foremost, a blues or rhythm and blues band. They listed their main influences as artists like Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, and Ray Charles. So they were very connected to and open about their influence drawing from black musical traditions and black musicians. However, Hamilton's article goes on to say that the Stones' channeling of these black musical influences, when combined with the bad boy image that was cultivated by Andrew Oldham, had the effect of playing up existing stereotypes about black music and black musical communities. Things like their association with violence or respectable listeners giving them a wide berth, even tropes like the blues narrative trope of encountering the devil, such as in the Rolling Stones song Sympathy for the Devil. Simultaneously, though, the Stones also whitewashed these black musical styles, which granted them opportunities that would not be given in parallel to black musicians playing the same music or similar sounding music. What do I mean by that? Well, of course, the Rolling Stones came in playing this very heavily blues and rhythm and blues influenced rock music, and yet there were others who were playing that kind of music who wouldn't get the same sort of mainstream elevation and platform that the Rolling Stones got. So the Rolling Stones got to have a mainstream platform as a white rock band, while also profiting off of the bad boy image that was cultivated from their associations with and leaning into their associations with black musical styles and influences. One example of this whitewashing concerns the involvement of Mary Clayton, a black woman who contributes on different Rolling Stones records, including Gimme Shelter, and whose voice is pivotal to the sound of this hit song. And yet, Mary Clayton's contributions are often erased from the story. She's not considered a central part of the band. She's often not talked about when listening to or analyzing Gimme Shelter. Her contributions become erased even though they're so pivotal to the making of that song. And so I find the Rolling Stones to be a fascinating paradox and enigma, as do Professors Coelho and Hamilton. On the one hand, the Stones were incredibly vocal about naming the black musicians who were their influences, once even saying that all their music was just footnotes to Chuck Berry's guitar playing. And there was no one who was a more vocal proponent of black musical styles such as the blues on the mainstream level. However, on the other hand, the Stones did get to experience a mainstream success as a white rock band that the black musicians playing the styles that they were emulating and drawing influences from often did not. In other words, they were able to package and rebrand the sound of these black musical styles for consumption by mostly white listeners on a mainstream level. In this way, the Rolling Stones could be thought as very much comparable to someone like Elvis Presley in the 50s rock and roll. Now, Fleetwood Mac is one of rock's longest artist acts, weathering drama and personnel changes through quite a bit of this time. What I find interesting is that Fleetwood Mac has quite a bit of romantic drama reflected in the band's story that they sort of bring to the front in their albums, especially in their album Rumours, which became their chart topper in 1977. Like Black Sabbath, Fleetwood Mac has a long history of personal drama and disagreements, different members leaving and rejoining and coming together for reunion tours and the like. One of Fleetwood Mac's best-known vocalists, Stevie Nicks, is an influential woman artist within the annals of rock. She fought for creative control on a number of different albums and within the band, ultimately pursuing her own solo career for a time to show that she had the independence to make it on her own as a musician. She proved herself an effective songwriter on the album Rumours, which is probably their bestseller, as well as wrote the song Dreams, which is also probably their number one hit. Now, Stevie Nicks had her album Belladonna, which is her solo album, in 1981, which tries to represent a multi-dimensional woman's perspective, and that has become very influential as a project and as a statement for women artists to this day, whether it be Lorde or Beyonce, Lady Gaga, Destiny's Child, and so on. So Stevie Nicks' influence has become quite tangible, certainly in the present. The band's album following Rumours, Tusk in 1979, as well as Stevie Nicks' general fashion choices and her musical style, influenced the goth movement, which was starting to come and rise in this time, particularly in the UK. I think Fleetwood Mac is a great example of how versatile a band considered classic rock can be. Fleetwood Mac just combines a number of different influences, from folk, blues, hard rock, psychedelic, and even some pop influences. All this sort of synthesizes together in the sound of Fleetwood Mac, depending on which album you're listening to, and so they become a classic rock band that is very chameleonic with a variety of different sounds and styles, much like the Beatles themselves.